Hi, everyone. We're live. I'm Sandra Harris, Executive Director of AWA. Thanks for joining us for another webinar. A couple housekeeping things. This is webinar style, so you can see and hear us, but we're going to communicate with you via the chat. So if you look up to the top, you see the chat bubble. I will enable that. And that is where you can make comments, ask questions throughout. Great. So I'm excited today. We have Nicki Traikos with us, who is a watercolorist, but she's actually worked in different mediums throughout her career. She's an instructor, she's an author. I'm going to put the link to her website in the chat. And she also works with Winsor Newton as one of their artists. And Winsor Newton has been a huge supporter of AWA with great in-kind gifts for all of our shows. So we're very grateful. So Nicki is going to walk you through a demo using some of her favorite paints and share tips, and you can ask questions throughout. At the end, we will have a drawing for your own set. Nicki has her own set of watercolors. Yay! With Winsor and Newton. There it is, and that's a $60 value. I looked it up. It's lovely. So stick around for that, and we'll do a drawing for the people that came today. So welcome, Nicki. Thank you for being here. And I am going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sandra.
Yes.
I'm really excited to be here. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Nicki. I'm probably best known for my Watercolor Made Simple classes and book. My approach to art and painting really is to have it be very approachable, very welcoming and warm. So before we get started, I just want to say thank you to Sandra and for hosting us today alongside with Winsor Newton. They have been so supportive of art and my art practice, and it's incredible to be able to come together and to share everything that I'm going to share with you today. So before we get started, what I'm going to do is share with you what project we are working on, and I'm going to flip my camera in just a few minutes. This is the painting. This is the inspiration. I was playing around with color mixing yesterday, and I love to give myself a little bit of freedom when I'm painting projects because I'm inspired by some new color mixes that I'm going to show you that I have out right now. So I'm going to use this as an inspiration, and I hope that you paint along with me. When you see my desk, you'll hopefully be able to do a little line drawing so that you can work alongside me. And if not, this session is being recorded, so just relax into the moment, and I'll take you through some of my favorite supplies and how I like to approach watercolor painting. So I'm not sure, and I can see you in the chat, but I'm not sure if you have experience with watercolor or not, but it is just a really beautiful medium to lean into, especially when you have a few techniques and the right tools by your side to help you through the process. So I'm going to flip my camera so that we can look at my desk and show you some of the goodies that I have on my desk. Here we are. So, I should mention as well, if you are following along and want to paint along with me, please do follow myself and Winsor and Newton, just at Winsor and Newton on Instagram, and Life I Design as well. And tag us if you're sharing anything on social media. I love to see what you're working on alongside me. So I have picked out some of these beautiful new colors that Winsor and Newton is showcasing at the moment. They are a really beautiful mix of some brights, some old colors that will probably be familiar to you once I start chatting to you about them as I start using them. And some of the supplies and things that I like to use are really handy at my desk right now. If you can see my desk, it is a little bit full with everything that I'm hoping that I will need for today's demo. But what we're starting with are watercolor paints, and the paints that I'm using are from Winsor & Newton's Professional line. If you are new to watercolor, then this part may fascinate you a little bit, and it is still relatable to other mediums as well. Watercolor paint is a water-soluble medium. I'm going to move this to the side, but I do want you to be able to see it so that you can hopefully draw it while I am chatting with you and you can be sketching along. So watercolor paint is a water-soluble medium. I'm going to dispense a tiny bit. It is in this tube form. It also does come in a dry palette. I personally like this tube form because, as you can see, I can just squeeze out a little bit and bring in my water jar here to activate it. Because it is water soluble, I can activate the paint very easily. And then it's ready to go in a very bold, I'll even get a little bit closer here so you can see that, in a very bold and highly pigmented form. So with watercolor paints, you just need a little bit of water to get it going. And especially straight out of the tube, you are all set to paint. Now, how watercolor is made is very similar to other pigments, whether you're using oil or acrylic. It basically starts off as, I'm going to show you a fun one actually. This stone here is a stone called, I wonder if anyone knows what the stone is. I can see the chat, so if you want to hop in the chat and let me know if you know what the stone is, that would be awesome. This is called a lapis lazuli. So this is an example of a mineral that is ground down and formed into a pigment that is used in paints, whether they're watercolor, acrylic, oil. This pigment is really the color that the tube of paint turns into. So here is my lapis lazuli, which is the original color, probably the most expensive pigment that was created, is now an ultramarine blue. So it is something that is a little less expensive, easier to mine because it is difficult to mine lapis lazuli and is quite expensive. But this pigment is ground down and then added to a binder, which is called gum arabic. So these two products together are bound and then created and turned into a watercolor pigment. So an oil paint will have a different binder. A acrylic paint will have a different binder. But for watercolor, that binder is gum arabic, and it allows the paint to move. It has a really nice, beautiful sheen. When you add water to it, it is just ready to go. Okay, so unique characteristics of watercolor is that it is water activated. Let me zoom out a little bit for you there. So activated by water, but one thing you need to keep in mind is when your painting is dry, so if you've worked on a beautifully finished piece, if any water droplets hit the paper, it can reactivate your paint. So very unlike acrylic or oil, you would need to protect your piece. And I recommend always framing behind glass if you're framing your artwork, just to make sure that you ensure that you protect your watercolor for a very long time after we spent so much time creating it. So this is an example of a mineral, again, the lapis lazuli, which is now ultramarine blue. I'm sure it's a color you're very familiar with. I'm going to show you one more because this is a color that I love as well. So sometimes the original or the starting pigment that we use is organic, like this root here. And I wonder if anyone is familiar with what root I'm holding. Again, if you want to hop in the chat, please feel free. But this is a root, and it is basically the starting point of rose madder. So it is the madder root that is, again, ground down into a powder form. We add some of the gum arabic to create that binder to produce this really beautiful rose madder genuine. So again, sometimes colors can be chemical or, inorganic, based on creating a less toxic, just a friendlier version of our paint. I'm going to just swatch this rose madder because I think it's a beautiful color too. There you go. So that's from the madder root, which is really beautiful again. Okay, So we have our pigment and the pigment and binder put together again to make our watercolor. The pigment is probably the most expensive part of our paint. So when I am looking to paint a more finished piece, something that I want to perhaps frame, even gift or sell, I like to use the professional quality Winsor Newton paints. And there are a few reasons for that. I know that the pigment quality of the professional line is really high. They do have another line, and this is actually the line that I started using 20 years ago. I still have my original set of Cotman watercolor paints. Again, this one is a tube form. It's still a great quality paint. The only difference between the Cotman, which is their introductory paint, is that the pigment amount is less than the professional line. So the cost is a little bit lower as well. So great if you want to try watercolor. Maybe you haven't had an opportunity to play around with watercolor paint. But I recommend even just grabbing a few smaller tubes of the professional line so that you can really enjoy the highly pigmented, saturated color that you get in a professional paint. Sometimes I get asked by students, Nicki, if there was one thing that I, would invest more of with respect to my art kit, what would that be? And I always say, I'm just going to flip the camera here so I can chat with you a little bit as I get organized. I always say, if you can work with the highest quality pigment possible, then your finished product will be a little bit more rich, a little bit more saturated, and you'll enjoy that finished product more. Sometimes we can work on a less quality paper or using brushes maybe that are a little bit more of an introductory range. But if you can work with a paint that's really highly pigmented, even in a pan palette like this one that I have next to me, it's still the professional line. It's just delivered in a different way. Again, you'll get that richness and that really vibrant color, but you'll also have control over being able to lift the paint, being able to blend and mix as well. Again, creating a better experience with your painting, but also having a better finished quality as well. Okay. So I'm going to show you what a dry palette looks like. Now, a dry palette, again, this is the Winsor Newton Professional Field Set. I've swatched all of the colors, so I know what colors I'm using as I take it to go. I just had this with me actually on a recent trip. It's just a different delivery system. So the pigment quality is still the same. You just have to activate them using a little bit of water. Again, remember our water-soluble paint. We just activate with a little bit of water. The benefit is you can take this set with you as you travel. I don't have my paper handy, but there you go. There's that beautiful sap green ready to go. So it can travel with you. It's not messy. It's easy to work with. I don't use a dry pan as often. I personally work in studio, so I like to have the tubes ready to go, and then I just squeeze a small amount onto my palette before I get going. Okay. So this is the dry palette versus a tube. I talked to you a little bit about the quality. I'm going to move this to the side. I'm hoping that you're able to sketch that out a bit. I talked to you a little bit about the quality of the watercolor professional paints. I want to also chat with you, and this can be helpful also when you're looking at other pigments. I think I'll actually pick up the French ultramarine because I love how that's organized and set up there. Sometimes when you're looking at packaging and maybe you're picking up a color that's new to you or pigment that's new to you, you're not sure what the color does or how it looks when it's dry or even when you're using it, because there are different characteristics to watercolor. Some watercolor can be very granulating, which means the particles are a little bit larger, so they separate when they're dry on the paper. Some can be very staining, like this Venetian red here. And the pigment is going to really absorb and be absorbed into that top layer of paint. But how do you know all of those qualities and characteristics when you're looking at new tubes of paint or new watercolor to pick up? There's a bit of information on the tube that you can look at. So I'm going to start with what's on the front. First, you'll see permanence A, and permanence means that Winsor Newton has tested the color quality or the pigment quality of their paints to see how light fastedness they are, see how long they'll last after you've painted them and hung them hopefully behind glass to enjoy. What they do is this test called the blue wool test, and this is this fun thing that I'm holding up right here. They'll actually dye wool with different types of dye and put it into a machine that will create a UV light on it. They'll cover one side and have one side exposed to that UV light and then be able to test the pigment. So starting from the least light fasted or the least long lasting or permanent to the highest permanence, which is your A, your AA, and even in your B range here, we consider that to be really good. So again, with watercolor, because it is a water-soluble pigment that goes onto paper, you want to make sure that your paintings are going to last a long time. So I think it's pretty neat that Winsor Newton tests that for you. And just by looking at a tube, I can automatically tell that this color is going to last a long time. So if I'm selling my artwork, I'm confident that my collector will enjoy the piece for a very long time. Another thing that I want to chat with you on this front side here, it might be hard for you to see, but it says Series 2. When you are buying paints, there are series numbers ranging from 1 to 4 most often, 1 being the sort of on the lower cost end for how much the starting pigment, so that little powdered, grounded pigment costs in order to create the paint that's in the tube. So a series 1 is on the lower end, and the higher the number, so I've got a series 4 here I can show you in the cobalt turquoise, it just means that starting pigment is, a little bit more expensive to produce, which means the quality of the paint, or not the quality, but the ingredients in the paint make it more expensive. So the cobalt turquoise will be a little bit more expensive than French ultramarine. And there are options if you're not ready to invest in a color that's a series 4. You can look at, colors maybe that are a little bit closer to a series 1. But again, just so you know, when you're out shopping or even online, Winsor Newton has a fantastic resource on there. Oops, I just dropped a brush. They have an amazing resource on their website. If you haven't subscribed to their newsletters, they have begun really sharing some interesting facts and history on pigments and how pigments are made, as well as resources for you to understand paints that you're purchasing, brushes that you're purchasing, and again, a little bit of history, which is neat. One thing that I also love that they've started sharing are stories of artists. They're sharing stories through the eyes of the artist, which is really fascinating and something that I've had the pleasure and the experience of having them share my story too, which is really neat. Again, in celebration of my watercolor book and a palette that we've put together. They really are a brand that focuses on artists and creating quality products that artists can use, as well as sharing their story. Female artists as well, being in this group with women, female artists, I think that's really empowering. So it's good to know that they're sharing the history of the pigment, what the characteristics of their products are, so that we can make a decision with maybe what we want to include next in our art arsenal and our tools that we get to use on a daily basis, which is kind of neat. Okay, I'm gonna get back to showing you some more of what wrong camera, there we go, of what you can read and get to know on these tubes. Now, it might be a little bit small to see, and again, I'm gonna try to do this without reading glasses, but on the back of the tubes, hopefully you can see that little box. I'm gonna pick up another one so you can see a different box too. There we go, it's clear. So there's one here that has an X through it. This is the terre verte, as well as the paint here that is cobalt turquoise that has sort of a half blocked out box there. what these little symbols are telling you is how transparent or how opaque colors are. So again, if I hold up my swatch here, you can see that Terre Verte is very transparent when I add water to it. So this little X'd out box tells me that it is a semi-transparent color. If I were to pick up Venetian red, which is this beautiful, bold, what I consider a historic color, if I were to pick up this tube, you can see the box is black. That's because it is a very opaque pigment. So that's really good, again, to know if you have maybe a preference to a type of paint that is a little bit more staining, or maybe one that is more opaque, at least you'll know that on the back. So it's getting to know the characteristics of the paint, which for me, again, is foundationally probably the most important tool in my art kit. And the last thing that I want to point out is, again, if you're curious as to what the pigment basis is, you can see PR 101 here. It's just pigment red. So it is a red pigment. And 101 is just when they classified the color. So it's just in the list of classification. And then again, you know sort of what that pigment is made up of. Okay, so I talked a little bit about, again, the quality of a professional paint and the benefits to that. Also the delivery system, which I think, you know, really depends on what your goal is when you're painting. And next up, I want to talk to you a little bit about brushes. And Sandra, let me know if there's any questions at this point. We are going to get to painting soon, I promise you. But again, I feel like showing you some of my favorites are really important before we get started. Now, watercolor brushes are made to be a little bit more dense in how they pick up water. Because it is a water-based pigment, we really want brushes that have, let me get it nice and close for you, that have thicker hairs that pick up a lot of water so that we can be pushing that paint around. The paint brushes that I'm using today are some of my favorite. They are the Professional Watercolor brushes in synthetic hair. A round brush, I can paint pretty much anything in round brushes as long as I have a nice large, a medium, and a detail brush. So it's sizes 10, 6, and 1 that I'm using today. I can have success with painting a lot of different subject matters and with ease as well. Now, I'm using synthetic brushes because I love that they are cruelty-free. Most often, if you're buying real hair brushes, the most expensive brush is a Kolinsky brush. It is very costly to manufacture. I definitely consider them to be a treat. But again, I feel like with synthetic brushes, the quality has come a long way that I don't miss using a weasel hair or a Kolinsky brush. These synthetic brushes are quite beautiful to work with. So I'm going to demonstrate those as we get painting. So last up, I want to talk to you a little bit about paper. When it comes to watercolor paper, I believe that you should work on the highest quality that you can afford. Working on a cold press is my favorite, and 100% cotton is really important. So those are the two things I look for when I'm looking at pads of paper. This one happens to be my favorite one. I reach for this all the time. So this is what I prefer to paint on. And a cold press just means, make sure we can get the visual on camera here. Hopefully you can see it, but there's a bit of texture to the paper. So when the watercolor is absorbed and is applied onto the paper, you can see that beautiful texture coming through. Hopefully the camera has picked that up. And again, it just helps create a really nice finished product that, is one of the unique things when painting with watercolor is the texture of the paper comes through and really helps with the texture of the watercolor paint itself as well. So this one, let me open it up again, is a hot press paper. So the difference between the hot press and the cold press is they're both 100% cotton. This is the Professional line, but the hot press is smooth. So you don't get that same texture. It is a really smooth paper that is still beautiful to work on. I just personally prefer to work on one that has a little bit more texture so that when my watercolor dries again, I can see a bit of that characteristic of the paper come through. Okay. So I just want to check in to see if there's any questions before we start moving some paint and getting started on our paint project. It'll give me a chance to change up my desk a little bit too. Sandra, maybe do you have any questions for me while I'm getting myself sorted? Let me get Sandra to hop back on. And it's okay if you don't.
I'm back. One of the things that came up for me as I was watching you describe all of the different colors, the first one was, do you ever get inspired by a palette first and then the subject matter comes, or is it always the subject matter that drives you?
That's interesting. I think it's the subject matter that drives me. This new palette that I'm working with, and I'm going to chat with you a little bit more when we start painting, is there's bright colors within that palette, which is a little bit more foreign for me. I like moody, earthy tones. So when I saw the cobalt violet, for instance, I thought, how am I going to incorporate that into my painting? So I think that it's the subject matter that dictates the color palette. And then I try to be a little bit more free with what I'm bringing into the color palette. But I think that was a great question. Made me think for a second.
It popped into my mind. And that was sort of you sort of answered this already, is how the colors were chosen for the set that your name is on now. That we'll be giving away later.
That's a good question. So the colors that I used in my book that I just created, Watercolor Made Simple, these would be my top 6 colors from my book that I describe as, if I was stranded on a desert island, what colors would I need to have with me? And I have them swatched. It's just a really nice, again, like earthy, warm tones that I can mix together to create some really interesting mixes. So whether I'm painting botanicals or landscapes, I feel like it's a great set that allows me to have a little bit of freedom and flexibility as I go.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead.
I will jump back off and we will get to painting.
Thank you. Okay, so here we are with the florals that I'm going to paint with you today. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the colors that I'll reach for and even some of the fun color mixes. As I was setting up my desk last night, thinking about our painting session today, I used these scrap pieces of paper to play around with some color mixes. And I actually discovered a new one that I want to explore more of for today. So again, I have my inspiration here that I'm going to have handy, and maybe I'll even put it to the side for you to see as well. But this is just going to be inspiration. I think I'm going to veer away a little bit from this color selection, but still using the beautiful palette that I have in front of me. Okay. And I may even put that one off to the side a little bit. So I like to start with a pencil drawing, and there are different ways to apply watercolor, whether you're working with a wet palette on dry paper or working with a wet palette on wet paper. It really depends on what you're envisioning in your process. But I'm going to work, I think, primarily wet on dry, starting with this beautiful color. So this is Terre Verte. This is a color that's fairly new to me, but one that's been around forever. And it's Terreverte, for those of you maybe who couldn't hear, or is a new color to you as well. It's a really lovely soft green color. And it is semi-transparent. It is one that has been used by the masters for a very long time, probably best known as Verona Green. And I'm going to swatch it. I think I'll have a palette handy that I can swatch on. And let's use the hot press so you can see that. So there is that beautiful Verona Green. So it was originally mined near Verona, Italy. And it's actually a color that a lot of portrait artists would use as their underpainting, which when I first discovered that, I thought, wow, that's really interesting to use that green tone that I would never think to use as an underpainting for portraits especially. But I'm going to mix it today with a permanent rose. So this is a color mix that I discovered, again, just playing around last night when I set up my desk in my studio here for our live. And I'm going to add it to my terre verte color. And so the permanent rose is a really strong tone because it is highly pigmented. And again, our terre verte is a semi-transparent. I'm actually dispense a little bit more of that terre verte. But again, looking at the color palette, it's important as artists to make things your own, play around with different color mixes, paint subject matter that speaks to you. I love vintage florals, so this feels very inspired by vintage florals that I love to explore and paint with. So it turns that beautiful, bright, permanent rose into almost like a deep mauvey tone. But when dry, the two pigments separate a little bit. I'm going to get in nice and close, and creates this beautiful new pigment or new color that then is, when dried, seeps into that texture of the watercolor paper as well, which is kind of neat. Okay. So I'm going to start with this. Oh, that's nice and close, actually. Let's keep it that close for a bit. I'm going to start with the center flower. And again, I'm thinking monochromatic. It is a flower that is, oh, there we go. My brush has determined where I'm starting. It is a flower that is the focal point. And again, I'm going to experiment. Hopefully I'll be pleased with the outcome with this flower being a little bit more toned in this mauvey purple tone, but I can always go over it with a brighter tone if I choose. And what I'm doing is just following my pencil lines, and you can erase your pencil lines a little bit more if you choose. I wanted you to be able to see where I'm going with the paint. So I left mine a little darker than what I would normally do. So I'm just lifting. So again, because I know the pigment quality is really good, I can lift away some of that paint to create a little bit of a highlight on the floral petals here. And by adding more water to the brush, I can continue to move that paint along and fill in these petals. Again, hopefully you can see the texture of that paper coming through. That's the cold press texture. That really does make the watercolor, the characteristic of the watercolor, shine, which is really neat. And that would be my first layer. So at this point, I can add, a little bit more of that permanent rose. And while it's still wet, I can start to just add in a deeper concentration of that pigment just around the center point of my flower here. Because I do feel like I want it to be a little bit brighter. And I'm working with my number 6 brush, but I think I'll even switch to my number 1 and pick up even more. I'll even pull out a bit so you can see my palette. There we go. Even picking up a little bit more of that permanent rose and dropping it in super concentrated in the center of that flower there. So when you pull away, sometimes when we're really close to our paintings, we don't see the depth of value, but when you pull away, you can really start to see just that little bit of depth happening in whatever it is that you're working on. I'm going to go in a tiny bit closer again. Let's go even closer. Just because as I'm dropping in, so I'm working wet on wet, you can see that pigment is just being pulled into the paper. And just by washing my brush off, I can start to, I had a little water drop, I can start to move and encourage, while it's wet, that pigment to move. And I'm thinking about the center now as I'm painting, and I'm going to even pull in. So I haven't put any paint on my brush. I'm going to pull in a little bit of that permanent rose pigment and start to create a little bit of interest in the center. And I'll keep that very center white for now, because I haven't decided what color I'm going to fill the center with. I'm going to wait until I have more of the piece painted before I make that decision. And with watercolor, if you want to create whites, I always recommend to preserve the white of your paper. But look at again how that pops. And even though I have that moody, it's almost like a deep mauve tone, it works because the mauve was created with that permanent rose, which I really love. And then look how different it looks from our inspiration here. So again, taking artistic liberties and really just enjoying the process, I think is huge when you're working on any type of art. So next up, I am going to dispense a little bit of that lemon yellow deep. So again, this is part of this palette that Winsor Newton is sharing at the moment. It is a really warm, rich yellow. It produces some gorgeous tones. I'm going to use it as an underpainting. I think what I'm going to do is use it for an underpainting for these two, and I'm going to keep them in that orange family. We'll see how it goes. And if I need to tone down the warmth a little bit, I can easily do that. So I'm imagining just the tips of these petals to be stained with a little bit of this lemon yellow. And I also like to turn my paper around so that my hand is comfortable while I'm painting, but I am not wanting to make you dizzy because on camera sometimes that can be a little bit uncomfortable. So I'm just kind of moving that paint around again because I'm using really pigmented paint to begin with. I have freedom to move color around and to mix it onto my paper. And as I'm looking at these two flowers now, I almost want to bring this yellow into the center. And instead of going with a dark center, I might stick with a light center for these florals. So I'm imagining these ones will be a little bit on the warmer side. So color that I'm thinking to use is this Venetian red. So again, another, color that has been revived, I feel, in how we're using it and what we're doing with it. It is opaque. It's really rich and deep. It's an earth pigment, primarily or originally mined near Venice. So painters like Titan would source these colors, also known as, I always mess this up, caput mortem. I probably messed that up. Excuse me if I have, or forgive me if I have. But it's a beautiful, rich pigment, but I can add a lot of water to it. So if I choose to just use a hint of it and have it blend into that warm yellow, then I can easily add some water to it, knowing that it's so richly pigmented that it'll still give me that beautiful depth that I'm imagining for this flower. So again, just kind of working on, from the imagination. This flower bouquet really is just fun, maybe expressive, and I'm giving myself a little bit of time to even blend on my paper. So because I'm working on 100% cotton paper, I can add quite a bit of water to the paper and even blend my pigments directly on the paper. If you work on paper that is maybe made out of pulp, you'll find that you can't move the paint around as easily and you'll have trouble blending. I think I want this flower to be a little bit lighter. So working on 100% cotton, that's sort of one of the benefits. So it accepts a ton of water. You won't get the buckling, and you can, again, really work that paint in. So even if I want to come in when this is fully dry and lift off some paint, I can go ahead and do that quite easily with success and enjoy how it will look after. Again, just adding a little bit of depth to the bottom of that flower. Let me zoom in a tiny bit. So as the water is starting to, evaporate by just being in a warm climate and drying on the surface of the paper, I have different levels of wet on my paper. So the center of my flower is still quite wet, but these outer petals here, I would say a damp, not necessarily a wet, but I can still go in and just by tapping, I can add in just another level of pigment and start to create some beautiful natural shadows while allowing the pigments to blend together. So you can see in there, I'm just letting the pigments do their thing and see what happens when they start to dry and as they interact with one another. Looking at it now, I think I'll go back, when that flower is dry to create some definition and depth. But again, really interesting. And even as it's starting to dry, I can still move that pigment around if I want to encourage it to maybe dry a little differently, quite easily, just with a damp brush. And I keep off camera, I keep just swirling my brush into my water jar, and I've got my towel here that I can dab off. Oh, I'm really excited by that. I'm glad that I have this beside me as a reference, and then using the painting, just again today, a little bit of freedom to play around with what that end result looks like. So I think I'll take a break from these front flowers here. And I do love working with cobalt turquoise to paint blue flowers. I feel like sometimes blue is overrated for florals. I love painting, light blue florals, like in my example, using the cobalt turquoise just on its own. I think it's a beautiful color. It's a blend of blues and green pigments, and again, comes from the original French word turquoise. So semi-precious stone that was used to create the color initially, and one that was exported to Europe and Persia, I believe, from Turkey. It has a beautiful opacity to it, but if you add some water, you can get that really nice translucency as well that I love. So again, highly pigmented, but adding a bit of water, and you can see that movement in my puddle here, will create a really nice, just a transparent version of that beautiful cobalt. So I like to use a cobalt really watered down at first, almost painting in the floral. And then I like to drop in a higher pigment. So I'm just going to carefully, and I might switch brushes in a minute, and I'm going to work so that I am on petals that aren't necessarily touching, just to give the watercolor a chance to dry. Let me get it nice and close for you. There we go. Just so I give the watercolor a chance to dry slightly before I start to drop in some of that darker pigment. And I even thought about putting a bit of yellow, but since there is stronger yellow throughout the bouquet here, I think I might just do turquoise for this one. We shall see. And again, moving to this flower, trying not to get my hand into the wet palette, working just again with the tip of my round brush and pulling that paint slightly down the flower here. Again, working with watercolor can be a beautiful process and also meditative. If you really just let the medium do its thing. I think this is one that I just drew in because I thought just compositionally it needed something. I'm going to paint it a little bit of blue and maybe add some green to it after. But again, that's just my first layer. I can even go back and remove a slight bit. I want my paper to be damp so that now I can go into my petal, and I want you to see how much pigment. So it's going to be very opaque. So my brush is a little bit on the drier side, but my paper is ready to accept. Oh, hopefully you saw that spread. Let me get it nice and close. I feel like this is the satisfying part. So just as it's still wet, it can spread and move and create that really pretty highlight. So maybe even here, I'll go into the bottom and just let it spread and move. Again, so if your brush stroke is following a wet or already wet area on the paper, it's quite easy to go in and add a little bit of pigment and then blend it away. So if you haven't worked with a cobalt turquoise, highly recommend it. There's even a cobalt turquoise light that I like to use that is just a little bit lighter, and it means my starting phase. I'm gonna go ahead and darken that top part there. Oh, and I love how that just blended in there. So it means my starting point is a little bit easier too if I want to lighten that color. So with the addition of the blue, again, it's starting to feel a little bit brighter and lighter, which is exciting. I haven't decided what colors I'll be using for these two florals. And for the moment, I think I'll just let everything dry and start to mix up a green. Now, if we look at the colors that we have at our starting point here, which is colors that I wanted to feature today, I am missing my favorite green. So I'm going to incorporate using one of these colors by bringing in a color from my palette, which is permanent sap green. So this is a green that I love to use. Again, if I was stranded on a desert island, this would definitely be one of my top 6 that I would put in my pockets and take with me and hopefully have something to paint with. Okay, so the sap green on its own, I'm going to show you what that looks like, and we're going to do a little color mixing because I haven't decided what I'm going to mix it with entirely. So that is the permanent sap green. Again, a really beautiful color. I feel like it's a little bit more staining. This is on the hot press paper, so it's a smoother paper, but I can easily pull that pigment away and enjoy a little bit of that transparency as well. I'm actually thinking I'm going to mix a tiny bit of magnesium brown. So again, part of our beautiful range of colors. This magnesium brown is quite granulating. So granulating means that, again, the particles are a little bit larger, so they'll separate. And when dried on paper, you'll see that beautiful texture come through naturally. If you love that granulation, but you're working with a color that doesn't granulate, I have discovered through working with Winsor Newton some mediums. If you paint with acrylic or oil, you're probably very familiar with mediums, but mediums in watercolor is relatively, actually quite new for me. Something I've just been playing around with now as being a part of their Winsor Newton's education program. I love mixing this into watercolor paint that doesn't have that granulation. So I actually have something handy that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to let this dry a little bit and show you this. So this is just a swatching sheet that I created as I was playing around with some of the mediums. If we look at this ultramarine blue at full strength, you can see how beautiful and saturated it is. It's quite flat in the texture and the finish, and it is quite opaque. If I were to add some granulation medium, so I pour a little bit of this medium into that paint, it creates the opportunity for the pigment to separate and for the granulation to occur on the paper. Just, you can see them seeping into the little ridges and texture of the paper. So again, if you love granulating paints, but maybe a color that you like to work with isn't granulating, you can play around with adding different strengths of that medium to create that granulation, which is really beautiful, I think, with watercolor. Again, one of the characteristics that I feel is really unique to our watercolor. So I pulled out permanent sap green and some of the magnesium brown. Let me get back on track here, which I'm going to swatch for you. So that's our beautiful magnesium brown. And as it dries, you'll see that granulation. When I mix it with sap green, I have a feeling I'm going to create a really nice earthy tone that I'm, again, imagining, but we're going to see what happens. So we're going to do a little color mixing experiment here. There we go. So it almost feels like, to me, a vintagey green that I imagine for this piece. And if I feel like I need to pump it up a little bit with some brightness, I can definitely do that. But just by adding a little bit of that warm magnesium brown to the mix, again, it has a little bit of like an orangey tone to it. It adds a beautiful warmth to a green that might be a little bit on the brighter tone if you're looking for something that's a little bit more warm. So it's very light fast. It's a beautifully pigmented color, that magnesium brown. We are going to play by adding a little bit on my palette here. So I'm going to mix a tiny bit on my palette, but I'm also going to have them separate so that I can maybe drop in some of that green as well. Now I'm thinking I'm going to paint these leaves here in this green mix, but maybe with the blue, I need a bit more of a brighter tone. So I'm just going to start at the top of this leaf and lay down that initial wash. Now I have a ton of pigment here to remember which leaves I'm going to paint in. My brush is fully loaded with lots of water and paint. Again, watercolor brushes are designed to really hold a nice amount of paint. I'm going to wipe off my brush and then come back and lift a little bit of a highlight. So I want them to be a bit more transparent. I want the leaves to be like the supporting actor in my painting. I want them to not be a focal point, but really just to complement what is already on my page here. And then I can always go back in again and drop in just a little bit more of that pigment there. So I like how that looks now, and I think I'll add it to this bottom leaf here as well. And I think it'll create some beautiful balance and also really frame this front petal or blossom here. Using, again, this is the sap green with the magnesium brown. And then just pulling away a little bit of a highlight. And I'll even get in a little bit closer so you can see that. So again, it's going to stain that paper, but I can pull away a nice little highlight there. And then I can even come back in, loading up my brush to add a little bit more depth. And then because the brown is granulating, as it starts to dry, you're going to notice there's separation between the sap green and the magnesium brown. Let me get in even closer so you can see that. So there you go. So you can see the granulation is happening and the green and the brown are separating slightly, which again creates just a really interesting texture and finish when your watercolor is dry, which is again something I love with working with watercolor. You can water down other mediums, but again, when you're working with this beautiful medium, I feel like just its natural characteristics get me most excited. There we go. So again, looking at the piece and compositionally thinking about my color palette and what colors I have available to me, I think I'm ready to go in with even maybe just the terre verte on its own. I wonder what that would look like on my the leaves sort of in this area. But I might bring in the sap green. So again, I'm kind of making decisions as I go, which I always welcome when I'm in this sort of art process. The more we can, be curious and have courage to try, I feel like the better. So this terre verte may not be strong enough next to my cobalt. So I think what I'll do is I'll actually mix in some of that permanent sap green. So let me go ahead and get my petal going. And I can just go over top of it while it's still wet. That feels better. It feels like it better supports what's happening in this section here. And then I can even take that green and start to paint in the stem. So this will again start to bring in this part of our bouquet, creating some beautiful, and this leaf belongs to this stem, creating some beautiful contrast and interest. And if I wanted to even punch up this green a little bit more, I can grab the warm yellow. And while it's still wet, yellow is a strong color, so you're going to see it really push and separate the green here. Hopefully you can see that. My brush stroke wasn't too wet, but I can even punch up this leaf there by adding some of that yellow. And again, letting it dry because it'll create a beautiful finish when it's dry. Those colors that kind of compete. This area here of the flower I've left for the moment because I want to wait till it's entirely dry. But we'll add in these supporting. I'm going to continue it down a little bit. And again, because this blue is a beautiful, crisp, cool blue, I think they complement this sap green a little bit. And there is even a leaf that I tucked in behind there, but I want this front leaf to be fully dry so that I can define that leaf that's in the back there. Let me zoom out a tiny bit. Starting to come together, which is exciting. So for these lower stems here, I think a little bit of that bright green will be nice to see, and I'm going to switch to my number 1 detail brush, and I'm going to keep the camera a little bit further away so you can see that process of just starting to paint in these stems here. So again, the stem would belong to that flower, and sometimes it's even nice to tuck in an additional stem. There we go, that's 2, and I feel like we need a third that's just here. So I'm going against my pencil line, just intuitively. I feel like there we need a little bit of a thicker stem, which will be nice. Look at all that bright color. Again, beautiful color palette to work with. If you haven't worked with any of these colors that I'm demonstrating, pick your favorite and play around with it. And again, do some interesting color mixes like I did with that center flower. And even, you know what? Let's see if we can have a suggestion for what flower color center, the stamen, you think I should go ahead and use for the center of the flower. I kind of even like it light. So I'm open to suggestions. If anyone in the chat wants to let me know, I am open to it. So here let me make sure you can see. I'm just wetting the paper. While this part of my flower is dry, I can reactivate. Remember, watercolor is water soluble, so it can be reactivated with water. And just to fill in that little bit of the flower there. And I'm just looking at this one now as I'm getting close. I'm going to add a bit of detail here. So I didn't want it to be completely light. I did want it to have a little bit of color. It's, the part of the flower that comes forward a slight bit. So I'm going to define around it a little bit using my detail brush and almost working with a dry brush so I get that beautiful texture within the flowers. And that creates some really nice detail as well. I can go up this way. So you can see my brush. Hopefully you can see how the hairs are split a little bit. It creates a really nice feathering so that I can create some texture and dry brushing. So it's a subtle, hopefully you can see it on camera, it's a subtle technique, but if you wanted to create some texture, dry brushing is the way to go. So it just means your paper is dry, your brush is pretty dry, and you kind of go from there. Okay, let me zoom out and see how we're doing and do a little check-in. So as I'm looking again at the piece, I think that I can even punch up this Venetian red, and knowing that it's a really pigmented color, I'm going to dispense a little bit more because I feel like I can go a little bit heavier or darker with it. And I'm going to do the same dry brushing that we just did, but I'm going to define these flowers a little bit, and then I think decide which color to use on those 2 florals there. Okay, so I'm just mixing in that Venetian red with a tiny bit of the deep yellow. I'm going to dampen or wash off my brush a little bit on that paper towel and just using a bit of dry brush and bumping up the base of this flower here, which I think is really effective. Again, because I know that it's a really pigmented watercolor, I don't need a ton, and I can still achieve that gorgeous deep opaque tone, which is lovely. And it might even be a nice technique. So I can still feel that my paper is cold, which means the center of my flower, it was really wet, so it's still drying. I'm going to leave it for a little bit, but I'm just looking at these leaves here now that we're close in, and I can even go in and define a slight bit. I think I need a bit more sap green on my palette just to create, again, a little bit of depth there and interest in the leaf. I wonder if we should do a green center in that center flower. I wonder how that would look. Sometimes you just have to take a chance and try. You can always pull back the intensity, but sometimes you just have to give a try and see how it turns out. So again, just using my detail brush, I'm going to go in and dry brush a little bit of texture here. I don't want to go over the granulation too much, but I'll also add a little bit to this guy now. And I want it to be fairly light, so I just applied a bit of the paint and removing the excess, blending with my brush. So if you can learn to control your water when painting with watercolor, you'll have more success. Sometimes watercolor can be intimidating because it is unforgiving, but again, learning how to control the amount of water on your brush and paper, I think is really huge. Just got a little bit of a water drop here. Take that away. Okay, let me zoom out. Feeling really good. So these florals here, I originally painted them blue. I think I will leave them that blue color and bring in the Venetian red, but I'm going to mix the Venetian red with a little bit of the permanent rose. I think that will complement really nicely. It'll give me a punchy red, and it'll just brighten up that Venetian red. So I can mix a cool and a warm together and still have a lot of success with what I'm mixing. And these, because they're so tiny, I want them to be really pigmented. So they won't draw attention away from any of the other petals, but they'll still be something that will catch your eye, which I really like. So again, it's almost full strength of the Venetian red, and I just mixed a little bit of permanent rose to the mix. And I want them to be saturated and just a strong tone. I won't add a lot of detail to them. And I like how in my reference photo, I used a yellow top. I think that'll blend really nicely. So we'll go ahead and use that lemon yellow deep. And then I can add a deeper tone if I choose. I might even just leave it as is with the two colors, just for a little bit of interest. And I think these florals, I'm using a lot of water on my palette. I'm going to water down this cobalt turquoise and see how that looks. Maybe I'll even add a bit of, let's play and add a bit of cobalt violet. I'm going to mix it to cobalt turquoise. I'm just curious. I'm going to see what it looks like. Again, it could work. I may choose not to use the mix, but let's give it a try. So here I've got a very light wash. So I'm imagining a very light, transparent color. So I'm mixing in a bit of that cobalt turquoise. And I wonder if it's going to be too bright. Oh, I like it. It's even very similar to the center flower, but more of a violety blue tone. I think I'm going to go ahead with that mix and commit to it. So I'm just using, again, a lot of water, and I'm adding it. It makes it almost like a periwinkle blue, actually. That's a beautiful mix. And I'm hoping that as the colors start to dry on my petals, that maybe they'll separate a little bit too, very similar to what was happening with the magnesium brown and sap green. So again, I have a lot of pigment on my brush. It is a nice and thirsty brush. Oh, it's that, yeah, it is. It's like a beautiful periwinkle. So again, colors that, I haven't used for a very long time, that I'm still exploring unique color mixes with and finding these happy color mixes, which is really neat. So again, I'm hoping that they separate a slight bit. I want them to feel a little bit lighter, more transparent. So I can even, with a dry, clean brush, pull away a slight bit to make them really nice and light and airy to create that beautiful periwinkle blue. So again, because I've mixed a little bit of that cobalt violet, it feels like it goes really nicely with that front flower, which makes me happy. And then let's use some of that permanent sap green. Again, I'm going to water it down a slight bit. Hopefully you can see it on my palette here. And I want it to be really translucent as well. I've got quite a bit on my brush, so I'll wipe my brush off. Make sure my brush is nice and clean. Because it's a little detail brush, it'll pick up a ton and dispense it right away. So I want to make sure that, make it nice and close. I want to make sure that I have control, that I can get these tiny little, just really abstracty leaves. And hopefully you can see that, but the two colors are separating as they're drying. So it creates this beautiful granulating kind of effect. And then the texture of the watercolor paper will pick up on that and draw in some really nice texture when it's dry. So again, really tiny, just moving that paint around, creating a nice transparent wash of color. And I even think I'll use it on these flowers here because again, these are supporting flowers. I'm just going to drop in a tiny bit more pigment just to give it some variation. These are supporting flowers, so I don't want them to draw attention away. So using that same transparent mix and my detail brush, I'm going to create these really thin, wispy, fine leaves and stems here. Okay, we're almost there. That's great. So decisions on these two flowers. I'm thinking a really watered down, I'm thinking the Venetian red. I think it'll be a really great complement and really watered down. I like how the centers are transparent. And then I might even go green on the center here. I think green in the center of that flower will really pull everything together. And maybe even mix it with the magnesium brown. We'll see. I'll paint in these florals next and we'll see how it goes. So Venetian red on my palette. And I wonder if I'll even mix in a little bit of that lemon yellow. Sometimes I even just let the colors mix that are on my palette. Because I'm using all of the same colors in my piece, I know that they'll create harmony in my piece. Oh, and you can see the granulation there. So here's a bigger version of my swatch. So that's the magnesium brown with the sap green. And see, because it's dry, how it's separating and granulating. Even over here with that cobalt violet and turquoise. They're just separating as they're drying, creating that beautiful texture, which I love. So I can maybe even mixing in a little bit more of that yellow, because the yellow will separate as well and creates a beautiful, so this is the Venetian red, and you can just see that hint of yellow through. So I am going to go with that mix. I'm going to add a little bit more water, and I am going to turn the page slightly. Maybe we'll do it this way so my hand isn't in wet paint. And again, I'm going to start from the center, I think outwards. I want these flowers as well to be supporting flowers. So I'm going to start from the center, working outwards, and then blending that pigment, even pulling in a little bit more pigment just in the center here, making sure I work wet on wet. I'll give it a second so that it starts to dry. I'm going to do the same thing to this flower here. And then I'll pull away that pigment as it's drying slightly so I can create, again, just a really soft floral. So my brush is dry. I just patted it off on the paper towel or kitchen towel. And I'm just going to pull away that pigment. So I still have a concentration there in the center. And every petal should be a little bit different. It should be unique and not feel identical to the next. So even the amount of pigment that's left, creating that variation is really nice. And maybe go back in a slight bit. See that paint move. Yeah, that feels really good. So again, just something that's very light. and supportive to what's happening on the page with the rest of the florals. Beautiful just in there. And again, going to drop in. And once the piece is dry, you can always go back and I can add more definition. I can add more detail to the piece when it's dry to really bring it up a notch a little bit more. Just adding a bit more value and more detail can really change a piece for sure. But sometimes I like when there's, again, a little more openness and maybe a little less detail to a piece. Just creating a soft, transparent. I almost feel like the center here needs a little bit more. A nice, soft, transparent effect. I like really transparent watercolor pieces, so your choice, might be different, and that's great. And I think knowing, what you like in your art process and your finished product, I think is really key too. And I almost feel like we could even create little stippled sort of effects in the center there. I'm going to add just pure Venetian red. So watercolor dries lighter. Keep that in mind too when you're painting. So don't be afraid to add a bit more pigment as you're working because it will dry a little bit lighter. Okay, so I think a little bit of green for that center, and I may take a break to see if we have questions before I go back to see if it needs anything else. So I'm taking that sap green, and again, my brush holds quite a bit, so I'll just go into that center a little bit and zoom in a tiny bit. And I think that creates a really nice, and I can even create little stamen just by some dots. And even outer a little bit, just so they don't look so perfect. And I'm even looking at that center flower and going back into that original mix using my detail brush. I can define a little bit. Oh, I did feel something wet. That's the thing. If you don't turn your paper around, you run the risk of potentially getting your hand. So I'm just pulling away. It's very subtle, but it'll give this center flower a little bit more personality. You can even go to the outer edges of the petal. Because it's so bold and large, I feel like it needs a little bit more texture and variation too. Just turning my piece around. I do want some of that light paper to shine through still and create a bit of shadow with this petal. But then that way that flower is not so flat, which I think is really important. Okay, let's pull away again and take one last look. And I wonder even if the center of these flowers, so again, I'm taking that lemon yellow deep and I'm going to go in and just create some stippling. So tone on tone, that's yellow on yellow, but creating that stippling just a little bit, I think is really effective. Okay, so I'm going to give this a moment to dry before I take one last look and see if there's anything that I want to add at this point. Sometimes what I like to do is really let it fully dry, and then I take a kneadable eraser and I'll erase some of the pencil lines because I know that that's going to create a really nice soft edge around some of the lighter flowers. And then I can even go in with my detail brush with more concentrated watercolor and add a little bit more detail, which I think is neat. Okay, I'm going to swap back to our cameras here and just see if there's any questions now. Sandra, what do you think?
Oh my gosh, I am in a trance. I don't know about everybody else. Everybody's pretty quiet. So I was just, it's so relaxing to watch you do this and have you narrate it. So I have to say that I'm not painting along. I don't know among us who is. I had a couple quick questions. So I know that you've worked in other types of media, and I'm just interested to know why watercolor has really become one of your favorites.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was a calligrapher and hand letterer for quite a while using very traditional dip pen and ink. So I feel like watercolor was just an extension of that really fluid media that I could, or medium that I could then start using with a brush. So when I started doing a bit more brush lettering, again, working with color, watercolor was really something that I thought I'll just try using, a very introductory line and see what happens. And then looking at how it dried on my paper, it was very different to my ink because ink is very saturated and opaque. The watercolor became this transparent, beautiful medium that when dried had a great texture. I love the blooms and the characteristics that watercolor offers when you just let it be. Some people don't like that. They like to be more in control, but I really love it when the medium just does its thing. So that's why I try to encourage the watercolor to flow a little bit, but really try to allow it to move and settle as it may. I started with acrylic paints, essentially.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So watercolor was a little bit of a transition. And even when I go back to acrylic painting, I feel like I have to switch my process. But I can't get that same texture and movement with acrylic as I can with watercolor.
Well, it was interesting right when you were starting, and you mentioned the brush determined where you started because there was a drip. Is that part of it? Do you enjoy that when maybe you had a plan, but the brush decides something else for you?
Sometimes. Sometimes. I feel like watercolor is one of those mediums where you have to let go a little bit.
Okay.
And maybe the perfectionist side of me sometimes wants to control. Like if that were to happen in a less desirable way, if it maybe dripped on something that was more finished, it could cause a little bit of, stress. But the great thing, again, working with that 100% cotton paper, I can easily pick up a watermark or a drip like that just with a clean tissue or a clean paper towel.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, which is good to know. So again, you're still in control while the brushstroke or while the page is still wet, you still have a little bit of control. So knowing that technique, I think, removes a bit of that stress. So sometimes it's welcomed and sometimes it's not.
The other thing I was thinking, within the realm of watercolors, you really have done so much with floral, just beautiful floral. What draws you to florals in particular?
Yeah, I think it's just, I love nature in general. And I wouldn't consider myself to be someone who has a green thumb, but I love planting wildflowers. And I think it's just, I have access to flowers. They're around me constantly. I've cut flowers always. You can see I have a bouquet behind me. I again, really drawn to nature. And I think with flowers, you can get creative. So you can look at a flower and again, like today, paint it as you choose and be expressive with how you want to recreate it. It isn't like working on portraits where, your eyes, nose, mouth have to be in a specific spot. With flowers, I have a little bit of room to just use my own artistic license and play.
Do you paint in plein air often? Or do you just do sketches? And I know you do a lot of photography, but are you actually painting in an environment often?
I have been more so. Again, with watercolor, it's very portable, so it's easy for me to bring a small kit with me, and I do have kits that I travel with. But working quickly outside with watercolor is something that requires a bit of practice. So when I'm out, for a bike ride, or sometimes if I'm doing a long hike, I'll take a backpack with me and I'll have just a small sketchbook and I'll start a preliminary painting and then come back to the studio and work on it. I'll make sure I have photo references. I'm a little bit shy when it comes to painting outdoors and having people come into my personal space
and ask you questions. Yes.
And, kind of looking and interrupting. I feel like it's a private practice. But I know when I'm painting outdoors, in my environment, that's something that will happen. So I have to be open to it, but it's not my favorite. I like to kind of be in my personal space.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think everyone has their process, but I don't even listen to music. I really, when I'm painting, I like to focus in on what's happening in front of me without influence or distraction.
Nice. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I know you wanted to get back and take another look.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and see, because again, with watercolor, there's different degrees of wet and dry. And when the watercolor dries, it does flatten and lighten a little bit. So I do see moments that I am going to just have one more look at. So
And before we do that, since we're getting close to the end, I'm going to go ahead and announce that Kathy, Kathie, who has been here since you began, is going to win your set. So congratulations, Kathy.
Yeah. Congratulations.
So, Kathy, I will send you a private chat. If you can just email me directly with your mailing address, that will get sent to you. So congratulations for that. But I'll let you get back to your painting.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me do a little switcheroo here. Okay, so again, looking at the piece, and I'm going to move this one so it's out of the way so that we really, and remind you, go ahead and tag us if you painted along or if you choose to paint this during the recording. And initially, I thought that I would add a little bit more detail to these flowers here, and I think that's all it needs. I'm going to go ahead and using my detail brush, just load it up a slight bit, but I'm also going to dab it off because I don't want a ton of paint on there. And I'm just going to pull away a slight bit. So I really love how light the outer parts of the petals are, but I'm just going to add a tiny bit more of a deeper value. Just in there. So again, it's subtle. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see that. But it just creates a little bit more definition. And I might even take this green just over here as I'm looking to add a tiny bit more, to give it volume, tiny bit more definition. So again, this is something that you can come back to even in, a day or two. Looking at it with fresh eyes is always helpful. But I'm just dabbing in here, creating a little bit. And you can see that made it pop quite a bit. Might even take that blue mix and add a slight hint of that there to those two flowers. And I'm going to call it done. I'm pleased with it. I love using the color palette that we started out with, the Hero Colors. If you haven't tried any of these, that's our palette that inspired this version, which I think is really appropriate for the time of season that we're in right now with all of the blooms. And yeah, I am considering that done. Love it. Okay.
Just beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does anybody have any last minute questions for Nicki? Kathy says thank you. She's excited for her set. And again, that is a set that is available on Winsor Newton, and all of the colors. I listed all the colors as you were going, are all on that Winsor and Newton website as well. So any last minute questions or comments? I hope some people were following along.
Yeah, I'm curious if anyone did paint along, let me know.
Yeah, let us know.
Yeah, and just thank you for having me again, Sandra. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to Winsor Newton for creating opportunities for us to come together. I know when we first hopped on, I talked about, just how great it is to be able to watch another artist process and what they're using and doing. I know I love to do that. So I hope today was just that for everyone else who tuned in.
I think everybody's been quiet, just enjoying and watching like I did. And our thanks to Winsor Newton also, as I mentioned at the beginning, they've been very generous with AWA providing gifts to our award winners. in the shows. So we appreciate that very much. And we're excited to be able to introduce your work. You have the link to Nicki's website as well. She has other workshops and classes and resources. So be sure to follow her and get more information. And I'm not seeing any last minute questions. We have a quiet group today.
Or I just told them everything they wanted to know.
And it was just so incredible to watch. So I can't thank you enough for being here.
My pleasure. It was a great time to spend with you. Thank you.
And this will be recorded and on YouTube. So anybody who wants to rewatch it or share it can do so.
Amazing. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Everybody.
Happy painting.